Hello there, and welcome to Science for Sleep, where even the heaviest questions are allowed to settle softly. Tonight we're not looking up at the stars or chasing the edges of the universe. We're turning inward, into a place that is at once familiar and frustrating, a quiet corner of the mind that can turn a single moment of pleasure into something that feels unshakable. Addiction. It's a word that sounds heavier than it should for something that often begins so small. A habit, a pattern, a little spark of reward that the brain files away and then asks for again and again. And maybe you've felt that before. Maybe not in the way that people talk about in headlines or warnings, but in quieter ways. The extra scroll through a feed long after you promised yourself one more swipe, the endless refresh, the last cigarette, the extra drink, the little pull toward whatever it is that just won't quite let you go. And while we're here together, I wonder where you're listening from right now. Is it late? Is it early? Is the room dark or lit by the gentle glow of a lamp? Are you lying down, maybe already halfway to sleep? Or are you simply here because the world felt loud today and you wanted to hear something steady and calm? If so, I'm glad you're here. If you find this slow wander through science and understanding to be the kind of company you'd like to keep, I'd be grateful if you'd tap like or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner find the others who might also be looking for a softer way to think about difficult things. Because tonight's journey is not about judgment or fear. It's about why the mind sometimes locks onto a path and keeps walking it long after you wish it wouldn't. Addiction is strange, because it rarely feels like it starts as anything serious. It's almost never a sharp line. It's a slow drift, a little shortcut for relief or comfort that the brain learns too well. The science of it doesn't come wrapped in drama. It comes with neurons and chemicals and signals that evolve to help us survive. Only now they're playing in a world so full of stimulation that what once made sense doesn't anymore. The brain is a learning machine, and addiction is what happens when that learning becomes stuck, like a song on repeat. And maybe, if you've ever wondered why it's so hard to simply stop something that you don't even like anymore, this is where that answer begins. Because at the centre of it all, there's a part of the brain called the reward system. It's ancient, older than language, older than civilization. It was built for survival, not modern life. It's supposed to make food taste good so you remember to eat it. It's supposed to make connection feel good so you keep seeking it. It's supposed to give you a little spark of joy so you repeat what keeps you alive. But the modern world offers these sparks in concentrated forms, things so powerful they hijack that circuitry. And once the brain learns that path, it doesn't easily unlearn it. This is why telling someone to just stop is like telling the tide to turn back. It's not defiance, it's wiring. But before the wiring, there's a moment, the first spark, and it never feels extraordinary. It's a piece of chocolate after a long day. It's a drink shared with friends. It's a video you watch because you're bored. It's harmless until it isn't. And even then, it doesn't feel like a trap because you can still put it down. Except, slowly, somewhere in the quiet parts of the mind, your neurons start to notice. They mark it. They remember it. They make it easier next time. And what was once a choice starts to feel like the default. And yet, here's the thing that makes it even more complicated. The brain doesn't just record pleasure. It records relief. If something takes the edge off anxiety, or sadness, or stress, the brain remembers that too. In fact, it remembers it even more strongly. So now, it's not only pleasure, it's escape. And escape is powerful, because when you come back to yourself, you don't always remember the reason. You just feel the pull. This is why addiction isn't weakness. It isn't failure. It's learning gone too deep. It's the same circuits that help you master a language or play an instrument, except now they're locked onto a single loop. A loop that keeps repeating until the world narrows to the size of the thing you can't stop reaching for. And once it's there, the brain protects it, it prioritizes it, and before long, it starts to feel less like you want it, and more like you need it. And maybe you've seen that happen in small ways. in yourself or in someone you know. Maybe it's late night cravings or endless phone checks. Maybe it's something harder, something that hurts to look at directly. But if you have, then you've also seen that strange moment where, even when you know it's not good for you, even when you feel nothing from it anymore, you still go back. That's not because you're broken. It's because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do, only now it's doing it in a world that feeds it endlessly. But there's another part of the story, the part where this isn't permanent. Because the same brain that learns can unlearn, and the same loops that feel impossible to break can change. Slowly, stubbornly, but change all the same. Before we can even begin to understand how that happens, we have to stay here for a while, in this place where addiction begins, where it grows, where it turns from choice to compulsion. Because once we see it clearly, once we stop blaming ourselves for the thing that is really a trick of neurons and chemistry, we can finally see the path out of it. And so, as we settle into this tonight, we won't rush. We'll walk through it one step at a time. Because this isn't about quick fixes or loud answers, it's about understanding. And maybe, if you've ever felt the quiet weight of that pull, this is the moment to let it rest, just for a little while. Because the story of why you can't stop isn't a story of failure. It's a story of how the mind holds on and how one day it can let go. And as we move forward from here into the heart of it, we'll follow that path from the very first spark to the deep wiring underneath it. Because somewhere in that space between craving and calm there is an answer. And tonight, we're going to find it. Gently. If addiction feels like a pull you can't shake, that pull has a home, and it lives deep inside your brain. It isn't loud at first. It isn't even obvious. It's just there, woven into the way your neurons talk to each other, like an invisible thread that keeps tugging, and you might not notice it until it's strong enough to feel unbreakable. But it starts in a place so small you could miss it if you weren't looking closely. The brain has always been about survival. It evolved in a world where finding food, or safety, or comfort was rare. And so, when it discovered something good, it built a way to remember it, not just with thoughts, but with chemistry. And at the center of that chemistry is dopamine. People sometimes call it the pleasure chemical, but that's not quite right. Dopamine isn't what gives you the joy. It's what tells your brain that something is worth doing again. It's a teaching signal, a marker that says, pay attention, this matters, do this again. And that's where the hidden hook begins. Because when something floods the brain with dopamine, it doesn't just feel good. It carves a groove, a little shortcut in the way your neurons fire. And the next time you see that thing or smell it or even think about it, the brain remembers and fires up that same pathway before you've even touched it again. It's as if the brain whispers, oh, this one, yes, this is important. And every time you repeat it, that groove gets deeper, like footsteps worn into a trail, until you can't help but follow it. But there's something else that makes this even stickier. The brain isn't just a single smooth system. It's a network. And inside that network, there's a region called the nucleus accumbens. This is one of the main hubs of the reward system, and it doesn't just react to the thing itself, it reacts to the anticipation. That means even before you take the first sip, light the first cigarette, or open the app, your brain is already firing signals. It's already halfway there. This is why cravings feel so sharp. They're not about the thing you're doing in the moment. They're about the memory of what it promised you last time. And here's the quiet trick addiction plays. Your brain doesn't really care if that thing still gives you joy. Once it's learned the loop, it doesn't stop to ask if it's fun anymore. It only knows that it used to be, and that memory is enough. So even when the pleasure fades, the habit remains. It's like the brain running on old instructions, following a map that no longer leads anywhere, but still feels familiar enough to trust. Now add to that the way dopamine is supposed to work in a normal brain. Small, steady bursts here and there. A meal you enjoy, a hug from someone you love, the satisfaction of finishing something hard. These are the signals that keep you balanced. But addictive substances and behaviours don't play by those rules. They don't just nudge the dopamine system, they slam it. They flood it with a surge far bigger than anything nature ever intended. And the brain takes note. It starts to adapt. It dials down its sensitivity. It says, if this is the new normal, I'd better get used to it. And so, what once gave you a rush now only gives you enough to feel level, and without it, you feel lower than before. This is tolerance, the quiet remodeling of your brain so that enough is never really enough. But the hook doesn't end there, because while the reward system pushes you forward, another part of the brain steps in, the amygdala, the stress center. This part remembers how bad it feels when you're deprived of the thing you've come to rely on. It holds that discomfort like a warning. So now, you're not just chasing pleasure, you're avoiding pain. Two forces pulling at the same loop, until it's not about wanting it anymore. It's about needing it, just to feel like yourself again. And all of this is happening below awareness, while you're busy convincing yourself that next time you'll stop, that this is just the last one, or that tomorrow will be different. Meanwhile, your brain is busy reinforcing the same pathways, strengthening the same connections, rewarding the same signals. You're not weak, you're wired, and that wiring is powerful. But there's one more twist that makes the hook nearly invisible: the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that's supposed to help you make decisions, weigh consequences, and resist impulses. It's the rational voice, the one that looks at the bigger picture. But under the constant weight of an addictive loop, this part of the brain starts to lose ground. The reward system shouts, the prefrontal cortex whispers, and little by little, the balance tips until what used to be a choice now feels automatic. And yet, if you step back and look at it from a distance, you can see that this isn't permanent. The brain is plastic. It rewires. It learns. It can also unlearn. But in the moment, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're standing in a groove too deep to climb out of, one that started so small and now runs straight through you. And even if you hate it, there's a part of your brain that keeps saying, one more time. But here's the strange comfort in all of this. When you understand that this hook isn't a matter of weakness or willpower, but biology, it stops feeling like an enemy inside you and starts feeling like something you can actually map, something you can change, not all at once, not easily, but slowly, the same way it was built. And that's where we'll keep going next, because if this hidden hook begins in the reward system, it doesn't end there. It spreads into everything: memory, stress, habit, even the way you see yourself. And once you understand those pieces, you start to see how the loop tightens, and eventually how it might loosen again. And as we move further down this path, remember, it's not about blaming yourself. It's about seeing the machinery of the mind clearly. Because when you see it clearly, it stops being a shadow. It becomes something you can step out of. If the hidden hook in the brain is where addiction begins, the next step is understanding why it holds so tightly. And it always comes back to one thing: dopamine. People call it the pleasure chemical because it's easier than calling it the reinforcement signal that shapes almost every decision you make. But the truth is, dopamine isn't about feeling good. It's about making sure you keep chasing what your brain has decided matters. Imagine this for a moment. You're hungry. You take a bite of something you love. The taste is rich. Your brain fires off dopamine, but not in the way most people think. It's not rewarding you for the bite you just had. It's training you for the next one. It's teaching you that this is worth repeating. That same mechanism is what once helped our ancestors survive in a world where rewards were scarce. You found food. You remembered it. You sought it again. But now, in a world of instant access, the same mechanism has been hijacked. Instead of occasional nudges, it's getting slammed over and over until what was once a gentle guide becomes more like a leash. This is the part that makes pleasure so deceptive, because at first it really does feel like pleasure. When you light that cigarette or take that drink or press play on another video, you're not thinking about brain chemistry, you're thinking about how it feels. But that feeling is a trick, a little burst that fades almost as soon as it arrives. And in its place, there's a memory, a trace left in the brain that says do it again. And because that trace is so strong, you start to mistake the craving for enjoyment, even when you're no longer enjoying it at all. The nucleus accumbens, the reward hub we talked about earlier, isn't just reacting to what's happening, it's reacting to what's about to happen. Dopamine spikes in anticipation, not satisfaction. That's why sometimes you can spend hours chasing a thing without it ever really feeling as good as you expect. It's not broken, it's doing exactly what it evolved to do. Keep you moving forward, keep you coming back. And here's where the illusion of control slips in. Because in the early days, you can still stop. Or at least you think you can. You say you'll only do it once more and then you'll quit. You tell yourself you're in charge. And for a while, that might even be true. But slowly, as those dopamine pathways get carved deeper, the balance begins to tilt, and you don't even notice it happening until suddenly it's easier to give in than to fight back. And you convince yourself that's still a choice. What's worse is that the brain doesn't treat every source of dopamine equally. Natural rewards, like food or connection or a sense of accomplishment, come with built-in limits. Eat enough and you're full. Laugh long enough and you're tired. But addictive substances and behaviors have no such boundary. They keep pushing that system past what it was designed for. The brain adapts by lowering its sensitivity so that the same hit feels smaller and smaller until you're not chasing pleasure anymore. You're chasing the memory of it. And if that sounds bleak, it's because this is how the trap tightens. You start out looking for a spark, and you end up running after smoke. But your brain doesn't care that it's smoke, because it still remembers the fire it once was. And that memory is enough to keep the loop alive, even when you know better, even when you've promised yourself you're done. And then there's the part that makes it worse: stress. Every time you're tense or tired or overwhelmed, the brain goes looking for a shortcut to relief, and dopamine is the bait. It offers up the easiest path, the one it knows works, and so the loop strengthens, not because you want it, but because in that moment it's the fastest way out of discomfort, and the more you repeat it, the more it becomes automatic until wanting it and needing it blur together. But here's something important to remember. None of this is a sign of weakness. This is how every human brain works. The difference between someone who gets hooked and someone who doesn't isn't about character. It's about how many times the loop has been run, how deep the pathways are carved, and how much the brain has learned to trust that shortcut over everything else. And yet, for all the power dopamine has, there's something almost comforting about understanding it. Because once you see it clearly, it stops feeling like magic. It's just wiring. And wiring can be changed. Not quickly, not easily, but it can be shifted. Because the same brain that learned the loop is capable of learning a new one. And that's where the story is heading next. Because if dopamine drives you forward, if it keeps you chasing even after the pleasure fades, then we have to understand how habits turn from something small into something that feels impossible to escape. Because once you know how the loop is built, you can finally start to see the first cracks in it. So let's keep going and follow this trail to where repetition stops being harmless and starts becoming the very thing that makes it so hard to let go. Because that's where the quiet chains begin tightening, and it's also where they can one day be undone. If dopamine is the spark that lights the fire, habits are the fuel that keep it burning. What begins as something small, so ordinary that you barely notice it, can grow into something that feels unshakable. The strange thing about habits is that they don't announce themselves. There's no signpost, no sharp turn, no moment where you know it has crossed the line from choice to compulsion. It just happens, slowly, quietly, until one day it feels as though you're following a script you didn't even mean to write. A habit begins with a cue, It might be the time of day, a familiar place, a feeling, or even something as subtle as the way a room looks. Your brain links that cue to an action. If that action gives you even the smallest spark of reward, it locks in the connection. This is the loop. Cue, action, reward, repeat. Every time you run through it, the wiring grows stronger, until one day you're no longer deciding. You're simply doing. Not because you want to, but because the path is so well worn that it's easier to keep walking it than to stop. And this is where addiction sharpens that ordinary loop into something heavier, because the cues that trigger addictive habits are everywhere, and the rewards they promise are immediate. Light a cigarette and the craving quiets. Take a drink and the tension softens. Open an app and the boredom disappears for a moment. Each time it happens, your brain takes note, it stores it, it remembers, and without you even realizing it, the lesson becomes permanent. This works, and because it works, your brain keeps it in the front of the line. But there's another layer that makes it worse. Habits live in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. This is the same system that helps you ride a bike or type without looking at the keys. It's automatic, mechanical, and efficient. Once a habit settles in here, it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for you to weigh the decision. It just runs. And when that habit is tied to something addictive, it means you can find yourself reaching for it even when you don't want to. By the time the rational part of your brain catches up, the action is already happening, because the machinery underneath you is already fired. This is why breaking a habit feels so strange. It isn't just about saying no. It's about interrupting a loop that has been carved into your nervous system. Every time you try to stop, your brain pushes back. Not because it's cruel, but because it's trying to protect what it has decided is important. That pull you feel isn't weakness. It's your brain doing what it thinks it's supposed to do, nudging you back onto the path it's been walking for so long that it doesn't even know there's another way. And then there's the role of emotion. Every habit, good or bad, has an emotional anchor. It isn't just about what you do, it's about how you feel when you do it. If you smoke when you're stressed, drink when you're lonely, or scroll endlessly when you're bored, your brain starts linking those feelings to the habit. Soon, the habit isn't just an action, it's a solution. At least that's what your brain believes. And that's why it feels so stubborn. Because now the habit isn't simply about the thing itself, it's about the relief it promises. But here's the trap. Over time, the pleasure fades, the comfort dulls, and yet the habit doesn't die. Instead, it tightens. You don't do it for the joy anymore. You do it because it's the only thing that quiets the craving, even if only for a moment. That's the shift, the quiet one, that turns habits into chains. They don't just hold you, they reshape you. They take up space where other things used to live, until it feels as though there's only one path left. And the more you walk it, the narrower it becomes. You stop noticing the little alternatives. You stop remembering the way it felt before it was automatic. And every time you try to stop, it feels like stepping off solid ground onto nothing. That's why so many people keep going. It's not because they can't imagine quitting, it's because after a while they can't imagine what would take its place. Yet here's the truth that addiction hides. Habits, even the strongest ones, are not permanent. They are powerful, yes, but they are not carved in stone. The same repetition that builds them can also undo them. And the first step isn't force. It isn't willpower. It's awareness. Because once you begin to see the loop for what it is, you can start pulling it apart. You start to notice the cue. You pause before the action. You begin to separate the craving from the choice. And that tiny space, that moment where you see it happening, is where the chain loosens. Not all at once, not in some dramatic rush, but slowly, the way new paths are always made, one small step at a time. But before we get there, we have to understand why these loops get so strong in the first place. Because this isn't just about repetition or comfort. It's about how the brain's reward system was built to repeat what works, and how that same design, when hijacked, can turn into the very thing that keeps you stuck. If you've ever wondered why breaking free feels so impossibly heavy, it's because the system that's supposed to help you survive has been rewired into a trap. And yet, there's something strangely hopeful in that too. Because what has been rewired can be rewired again. The same brain that built these chains can learn to loosen them. The same circuits that locked you in can one day open up again. But first, we have to follow this to its core, down into the very mechanism that drives it. So let's go there. Because if we can see how the reward system keeps these loops alive, we can also see how to weaken it, one link at a time. If habits are the chains that hold you, the reward system is the forge that built them. This system doesn't care if the habit is good or bad, helpful or harmful. It only knows one thing. What gets repeated gets stronger. That's how the brain has always worked. It's how you learn to walk. It's how you learn to read, and it's also why you can find yourself doing something over and over, even when you wish you wouldn't. The reward system lives deep in the brain, and at its core is dopamine. But dopamine is not what most people think it is. It's not just the chemical of pleasure, it's the chemical of teaching. Every time you do something that feels good or relieves discomfort, dopamine fires, and it leaves a mark. It tells your brain, this matters. Remember this, do it again. That's all it takes. One signal, one tiny nudge, and then the loop begins. When you eat something sweet, dopamine lights up. When you laugh with a friend, it fires again. When you accomplish something you've worked for, there it is. These are the natural rewards that shaped human survival. They were never meant to be constant. They were supposed to be occasional, meaningful and balanced. But the modern world doesn't work that way. Now, the reward system is surrounded by things that push it far harder than it was ever designed to handle. Substances, behaviours, and technologies that flood it over and over again until it doesn't just remember them, it starts to depend on them. Here's what happens when that system gets pushed too far. At first, the reward is huge. That first cigarette, that first drink, that first late night scroll, it lights the brain up. Dopamine surges, and the brain takes careful note. But the brain doesn't like things that are too loud for too long. It adapts. It dials down its sensitivity. What once felt intense now feels normal, and what was once normal now feels like not enough. This is tolerance. Your brain rewires itself to expect the flood, and when it doesn't get it, you feel it. And this is why the reward system is built to repeat. Because the more you push it, the more it pushes back, not by stopping the craving, but by demanding more. That's why one drink turns into 2, 1 hour turns into 3. It's not that you're weak, it's that your brain has been trained by its own chemistry. But dopamine alone doesn't explain why this feels so inescapable. There's another part of the reward system at work here, the learning circuits. Every time you repeat a behaviour, the brain strengthens the neural pathways that drive it. It's like walking through grass. The first time, you leave a faint trail. The 10th time, it's clear. The 100th time, it's a path so worn that it feels like the only way forward. Even when you want to turn away, the path is there, carved into the landscape of your mind. And here's the part that makes it even harder. The reward system doesn't just learn from pleasure. It learns from relief. If something takes away stress, even for a moment, the brain remembers that too, and it remembers it more powerfully than the pleasure itself. This is why cravings grow sharpest when you're upset, tired, or overwhelmed. Your brain doesn't just want the rush, it wants the escape. It's not chasing joy, it's running from discomfort. Over time, this rewiring creates a kind of trap. You're no longer doing it for the reward. You're doing it because not doing it feels worse. It's no longer about wanting, it's about needing. And every time you repeat it, the loop deepens. The brain says, this is the answer, even when it isn't. And this is why willpower alone feels so useless. Because by the time you're fighting the urge, the reward system has already done its work. It's already fired. It's already prepared the craving. You're not battling a choice, you're battling a reflex. But here's what most people don't realise. The reward system isn't broken. It's not even malicious. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem isn't that you have a reward system, it's that it's playing in an environment it was never designed for. In a world of infinite triggers, instant gratification, and endless repetition, the brain doesn't stand a chance without awareness. Yet, there's hope in that too. Because if this system can be trained to repeat, it can also be trained to stop, slowly, deliberately, through new rewards, new associations, and new patterns. The same machinery that locks the chains can one day loosen them. But before we reach the part where those chains begin to weaken, we need to understand the next piece of the puzzle, craving. Because if the reward system builds the habit, craving is what keeps pulling you back to it. And until you understand why craving feels so loud, you can't quiet it. If the reward system is the engine that keeps the loop running, craving is the voice that never seems to stop speaking. It isn't loud at first. It doesn't roar or demand. It starts as a whisper, soft enough that you might not even notice it. But the longer it lingers, the more it grows, until it's the only thing you hear, and by the time you recognize it, it already feels too late to quiet it. Craving is what happens when the brain learns too well. Each time you repeat a behavior that triggers a surge of dopamine, your brain takes note. It doesn't just remember the pleasure, it remembers the cues that came before it. The sight, the smell, the time of day, the feeling in your chest. Those cues become signals, and before long, they're enough to spark the craving all on their own. You don't even need the thing itself anymore. Just the reminder is enough to set the reward system in motion. This is why cravings feel so intrusive. You can be sitting quietly, not thinking about anything at all, and suddenly, out of nowhere, there it is. A flash of memory, a small urge, a quick thought that seems harmless but refuses to leave. That's because craving isn't random, it's triggered, and the brain is exquisitely good at finding those triggers and replaying them until they stick. At first, craving feels like a suggestion. You could ignore it if you wanted to, but the longer you sit with it, the stronger it becomes. This isn't just psychological, it's chemical. Dopamine rises not only when you get the reward, but when you anticipate it. The brain doesn't wait for the action. It prepares for it. It pushes you toward it. And the more times you give in, the faster this process becomes, until craving feels less like a thought and more like a reflex. And here's the part that makes it so exhausting. Craving doesn't even care if you still enjoy the thing you're craving. It only cares that once upon a time it worked. That first cigarette, that first drink, that first hit of sugar, that first endless scroll through your phone. It doesn't matter if it doesn't feel good anymore. Your brain isn't chasing pleasure, it's chasing the memory of it. This is why people describe craving as louder than logic. You can know it's a bad idea. You can tell yourself, not this time. But the whisper doesn't stop just because you understand it. Craving isn't reasoned with. It isn't convinced. It's simply a loop firing over and over in the background, fueled by the same circuits that evolved to keep you alive. And fighting it with nothing but willpower is like standing in a river and expecting the water to stop because you told it to. What makes this even more complicated is that craving is tied not only to pleasure but to relief. The brain doesn't just crave what feels good, it craves what stops feeling bad. Stress, sadness, loneliness, boredom, all of them feed the craving. Because if your brain has ever learned that a certain habit can quiet those feelings, it will remember it. It will hold on to it. And when those feelings rise again, so will the craving. And the more you answer it, the faster it returns. Each repetition strengthens the connection, not just in the reward system, but in the parts of the brain that handle memory and emotion. Over time, craving isn't just about wanting, it's about expectation, it's about inevitability, It's the brain saying, "Oh, we've been here before, we know how this goes." But here's what most people don't realise. Craving peaks. It doesn't last forever. It feels endless because the brain is loud when it wants something. But if you watch it closely, you'll see that even the sharpest craving rises, reaches a point and then fades. The trouble is, when you answer it every time, you never learn this. You only ever teach the brain that cravings are commands, and you obey them without question. And this is how the whisper becomes a habit of its own. Because you're not just dealing with craving anymore, you're dealing with the fear of what happens if you don't listen to it. You're dealing with the discomfort that builds in the silence between wanting and resisting. That tension is what drives the loop tighter until it feels almost impossible to break. Yet, there's a truth buried in this too. The craving isn't permanent, it's not stronger than you, it's just familiar. It's the same circuit firing the same signals, expecting the same answer, and the same way it was built, it can be rebuilt. But to do that, you have to understand it for what it is, not a sign of weakness, but a sign of learning. And if craving is the voice that keeps pulling you back, then the next piece of this story is about what happens when the brain stops feeling satisfied, no matter how many times you listen to it. Because if craving keeps you coming back, tolerance is what keeps moving the goalpost farther away. If craving is the whisper that calls you back, tolerance is the reason the whisper never really stops. Tolerance is what happens when the brain, in all its remarkable adaptability, learns to expect what once surprised it. It's what turns a single moment of pleasure into a chase that stretches on and on, always promising relief but never quite delivering it. In the beginning, the brain reacts to every spark like it's something extraordinary. That first time, the first drink, the first cigarette, the first endless scroll through a glowing screen feels powerful because the brain isn't used to it. Dopamine surges, neurons fire, and for a little while, it's enough. But the brain doesn't like surprises for long. Its job has never been to keep you amazed. Its job is to keep you stable. So it adapts. Each time you repeat the behavior, the brain adjusts its sensitivity. It dials things down. The same cigarette, the same drink, the same click on a glowing app. It doesn't light you up the way it once did. The brain has decided, if this is going to keep happening, I need to treat it like normal, and so it does. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The spark becomes a flicker, and you start reaching for more, not because you want excess, but because you're trying to get back to what you felt the first time. This is the cruel trick of tolerance. It doesn't just make the reward smaller, it pushes the goal farther away. You keep chasing it, but the brain has already moved the finish line. And the more you run after it, the farther it moves. That's why one drink becomes 2, one hit becomes 3. 1 hour turns into a night you didn't plan to lose. You're not greedy. You're not broken. You're simply living in a brain that has learned to expect the flood and now needs it just to feel level. And here's the part that makes tolerance so relentless. It isn't just about pleasure anymore. As the brain adapts, the baseline shifts. Without the thing you've been using, whether it's a substance, a screen, or even a harmless-seeming habit, you don't just feel neutral. You feel low. You feel off. Because what was once a surge of dopamine is now what it takes just to quiet the silence your brain has created. And that silence is loud. It shows up as restlessness, irritability, that hollow edge of unease that tells you something's missing, even if you can't quite name what it is. So you go back. You reach for the thing that once felt like a choice, and now it feels like the only way to feel normal again. This is why people say addiction isn't about getting high. It's about getting back to zero, because by the time tolerance sets in, the reward system isn't giving you joy. It's giving you relief. It's letting you escape the void that it helped create in the first place. And that's a loop that reinforces itself in a way that can feel unbreakable. But here's the deeper truth hiding in all of this. Tolerance is not a flaw in the brain. It's not even a mistake. It's the same mechanism that allows you to stop noticing background noise or stop smelling a candle after it's been burning for an hour. Your brain is built to normalize what happens repeatedly. It does it for survival. It does it for efficiency. It does it because it's trying to keep you balanced. It simply doesn't understand that this time balance is the thing pulling you under. And yet even this isn't permanent. The brain that learns tolerance can also unlearn it, slowly, painfully, with resistance at every step. But it can. That's why people who step away from an addictive loop often talk about the world feeling strange at first. Food tastes different. Sleep feels wrong. Pleasure takes time to come back. But then, quietly it does. Because the brain that once pushed the goal farther away can also bring it closer again. But before that happens, tolerance has one more role to play in this story. Because as it deepens, it doesn't just change how much you need, it changes how bad it feels when you don't get it. That's where withdrawal begins, and withdrawal is where the chains of addiction tighten the most. If tolerance is the slow shifting of the brain's balance, withdrawal is what happens when that balance snaps back the moment you take away what it's grown used to. It's the rebellion that follows silence. It's the brain and body shouting at once, demanding that you put things back the way they were, no matter how badly you wish you wouldn't. Withdrawal isn't punishment. It's not some cruel design meant to make people suffer. It's the natural reaction of a brain that has been rewired by repetition. When you feed the reward system the same thing over and over, it adjusts. It builds itself around that pattern. And when you suddenly stop, that pattern doesn't just vanish. The circuits that were firing still expect the signal. The chemicals that were flooding in are suddenly missing, and your brain doesn't like missing pieces. That's why withdrawal doesn't just happen in the mind. It spreads through the entire body. The restlessness, the ache, the anxiety that hums in your chest like static. It's the nervous system trying to adapt to a sudden emptiness. For substances, this can mean shaking hands, headaches, nausea, or a heaviness that seems to settle in your bones. For habits like screens or gaming or constant scrolling, it's different but no less real. You feel agitated, unsettled, as if the world has gone quiet in the worst possible way. And it isn't just discomfort, it's identity. Because by the time withdrawal shows up, the habit has been woven into your sense of normal. Your brain has learned to expect it not only chemically but emotionally. It's part of the rhythm of your days. When you take it away, the silence feels like loss. And the brain, built to avoid loss, pushes back hard. Here's the cruel thing about withdrawal. It convinces you that giving in will make everything stop. And in the short term, it's right. One drink quiets the tremor. One cigarette eases the edge. One more hour staring at the screen calms the noise. And every time you give in, your brain learns the same lesson. See, this fixes it. The loop grows tighter, not because you want more, but because it hurts less to stay where you are than to climb out. But here's the part that most people never hear. Withdrawal isn't endless. It feels endless because when you're in it, every hour feels like a wall you can't climb. But what the brain demands today, it demands less of tomorrow. Slowly, painfully, the circuits start to quiet. The chemistry begins to settle. The storm that feels permanent is really your nervous system rewiring in real time, fighting to find balance without the thing it's grown used to. Yet, in those first hours or days or weeks, it doesn't feel like healing. It feels like unraveling. Because every part of you that has been trained to reach for the habit is awake, loud, and begging you not to stop. This is why withdrawal isn't just physical, it's emotional. It's the sharp edge of craving mixed with the hollow weight of loss. It's why people describe it not only as pain but as emptiness, because the brain has been depending on something that suddenly isn't there. But this rebellion isn't proof that you're weak. It's proof that you've been strong enough to change something your brain didn't want changed. Every tremor, every restless thought, every ache is your nervous system recalibrating. It's the sound of pathways trying to find their way back to normal. And there's something else buried in this process. Withdrawal shows you exactly how deep the habit went. Every symptom, Every spike of discomfort is like a map of the places where your brain rewired itself. It's not punishment. It's a picture of where the work needs to be done, and the longer you hold out, the more that map fades, until the cravings lose their sharpness and the silence doesn't feel so loud anymore. Because here's the truth most people forget. The brain isn't fixed in place. It's plastic. It bends. It changes. The same way it learned to depend on the habit, it can learn to live without it. And every hour spent sitting with withdrawal instead of giving in is another signal to your brain that the old pattern isn't in control anymore. But before that rewiring can really begin, we need to understand what pushes people into this loop in the first place. Because tolerance and withdrawal don't appear out of nowhere. If withdrawal is the storm that rages when you take something away, stress is often the weather that draws you back in. Addiction doesn't grow in isolation. It feeds on the pressure of ordinary life, the quiet weight of expectations, and the 1,000 small discomforts that stack up until your brain starts reaching for the one thing it knows will make them fade, even if only for a moment. This is where the cycle of escape begins, not because you're weak, but because the mind is always looking for relief. Stress is ancient. It was never meant to be constant. In the beginning, it was a survival tool, a flash of fear, a burst of adrenaline, and then safety. Your ancestors ran from danger or fought through it, and when it was over, their bodies calmed. But modern stress doesn't work that way. It lingers. It doesn't come with an endpoint. Deadlines, bills, arguments, exhaustion. None of them are lions you can outrun. They sit with you. They wear you down. And when the brain gets tired of holding that weight, it looks for shortcuts. Addiction is one of those shortcuts. The reward system, already trained by repetition, becomes a way out. You take the drink, the hit, the scroll, or the bite, and for a moment the noise quiets. Dopamine fires, not just because of pleasure, but because of relief. That's the key. The brain learns not only that this habit feels good, it learns that it stops feeling bad. And in a world full of endless stress, that lesson digs in deep. Here's the problem. The relief doesn't last. It's a temporary escape, a small island in the middle of a storm. But when you return to the world and find that nothing has changed, the stress is still there. So you go back. And each time you do, the brain makes the link stronger. Stress means craving. Craving means relief. It's a perfect loop, and once it starts spinning, it's hard to slow down. The worst part is that this loop doesn't only respond to real stress, it starts to anticipate it. Your brain becomes so used to seeking comfort this way that even small discomforts become triggers. A bad mood, a slow afternoon, a single sharp memory. Anything can nudge the system into motion, and before you even realize it, you're already halfway to the habit. Not because the stress is unbearable, but because your brain has learned the pattern so well it doesn't need much to light it up. And this is why comfort becomes dangerous. Comfort isn't bad. Everyone needs it. But when comfort is tied to one narrow escape, one behavior, one substance, one habit, it stops being a choice and starts being the only option the brain can see. You stop finding other ways to soothe yourself because this one is faster, easier, reliable. And every time you use it, the brain rewards you for not just getting relief, but for taking the familiar path. This is how addiction builds its walls. Stress pushes you in, comfort holds you there, and the longer you stay, the harder it is to imagine leaving. Because even if you hate it, even if you want out, your brain has tied escape so tightly to this single habit that everything else feels slow and distant by comparison. But there's a truth hiding in that cycle. If the brain can link stress to a habit, it can unlink it too. Slowly, stubbornly, and only with repetition. That's why people who recover from addiction often talk about building new routines, finding new ways to breathe through the weight instead of running from it. It's not about removing stress from life. It's about teaching the brain that there are other exits. But before we can talk about how those new exits are built, we have to look at how deep the old ones go. Because stress doesn't just create a cycle, it shapes the way the brain remembers. And those memories are part of why the craving never truly feels silent. If stress is the pressure that pushes you toward escape, triggers are the sparks that light the fuse. They're the quiet, invisible switches scattered through the world, waiting to be flipped. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're so small you don't even notice them. But once they fire, it feels almost automatic, like your brain has been pulled onto a track it didn't choose. Triggers are built out of memory. Each time you repeat a habit, your brain doesn't just record the action, it records everything around it. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the time of day, even the emotions in the air. These details get stored alongside the reward. Later, when you encounter them again, the brain treats them like a shortcut, jumping straight to the craving before you even have time to think. This is why you can be doing perfectly fine and suddenly, out of nowhere, you feel the urge rise. A song plays and you remember the nights you used to drink. You pass a certain street and the memory of old habits hits you like it never left. You sit down at your desk and somehow you're already reaching for your phone, not because you decided to, but because the act of sitting there has always been connected to it. That's what triggers do. They turn the world into a map of cues, each one quietly pointing you back to the loop. And it isn't just external. Internal triggers can be even more powerful. A single emotion can act like a switch. Anxiety, boredom, loneliness, even joy sometimes. If your brain has ever paired those feelings with a habit that brought relief or comfort, it will remember. And when those feelings return, the craving follows. It's not that you want it. It's that the brain has been trained to see that moment as the beginning of the loop. This is what makes triggers so dangerous. They're fast. They bypass reason. Before your thinking brain can even argue, the older, deeper circuits have already reacted. By the time you notice what's happening, you're halfway down the path. And this is why it feels like you're being pulled, because in a way, you are. The brain is following connections it built long ago, ones that it has strengthened with every repetition. But here's the thing that makes it even more complicated. Triggers don't weaken just because time passes. They stay quiet, waiting, even after months or years. That's why people who've broken free from a habit can suddenly feel it again with surprising force just by stumbling across the wrong cue. One smell, one memory, one unexpected flash of the past, and suddenly the brain wakes the loop as if it never stopped. This isn't a failure. It's simply the way the brain stores learning. It doesn't erase old maps, it just builds new ones on top. And if the old one was carved deep, it doesn't take much to uncover it. That's why understanding triggers matters so much. Not to fear them, but to see them for what they are. Reminders, not commands. The danger comes when you mistake one for the other. If you think a trigger means you've already lost, you stop fighting, you surrender. But if you see a trigger as just a signal, you create space between it and the action. That space is where change begins. But for most people caught in the loop, that space doesn't feel real. It feels like the craving appears and then it's over. You've already given in. That's because the brain's reward circuits move faster than conscious thought. They're built to. They evolved that way because they were supposed to push you towards survival before you had time to debate it. Now, in a world where the same machinery is hijacked by habits and substances, the system is running on autopilot and it's pressing the same buttons over and over again. And this is where memory plays its quiet, relentless part. Because the brain isn't only storing cues, it's storing entire scripts. Every time you follow a trigger to its conclusion, the brain reinforces the whole sequence. That's why triggers don't just spark a craving. They make it feel familiar. They feel like the start of a story you already know how to finish. But if that's true, it also means the story can be rewritten. The same way your brain learned to connect triggers to an old loop, it can learn to connect them to something else. It takes time and it takes work, but it's possible. And the first step isn't trying to erase the trigger, It's noticing it without automatically obeying it. Because once you see the buttons clearly, you can stop treating them like locks. They're only switches, and switches, no matter how automatic they feel, can be flipped off as well as on. If triggers are the buttons that push you toward a habit, memory is the reason those buttons stay wired into place. Addiction isn't just about craving in the present. It's about the past living quietly in the background, shaping what you reach for before you even understand why. The brain is built to remember what matters. It's why you can recall the smell of a meal from childhood, or a song that takes you back to a single moment years ago. Memory isn't just a record of events, it's a guide. And when it comes to addiction, the brain doesn't just remember what happened, it remembers how it felt. That emotional memory is powerful. It's not stored in words or clear images. It's stored in the circuits that light up whenever the brain thinks you might need it again. Each time you repeat a habit, every drink, every cigarette, every late-night scroll, you're not just reinforcing the behavior, you're writing it into memory, layer by layer. The hippocampus, which helps form those memories, works with the amygdala, which tags them with emotion. Together they create something that doesn't fade easily, a record of how that habit once gave you comfort, even if it was fleeting. That's why simply deciding to quit isn't enough. You're not just fighting the present urge, you're fighting all the echoes of the times it worked before. This is why certain moments can feel so sharp. You might be fine for weeks, and then suddenly one small reminder brings it all back. A smell, a sound, a familiar place. It's not random. It's memory, pulling a thread that's been woven too deep to vanish. In those moments, it's not just that you want the habit, it's that a part of your brain feels like it already has it, and it's just waiting for you to catch up. And here's the thing, memory doesn't care if the habit actually makes you happy now. It doesn't check if it still works. It only knows that it worked once, and it will keep presenting that option to you because the brain is designed to favour what feels familiar. That's what makes the addiction loop so stubborn. Even after the pleasure fades, even after you hate it, memory is still there, quietly insisting that this is what you do when you feel this way. But memory doesn't only pull you back, it speeds up the loop. Because each time you act on it, you strengthen it. The more you repeat the behaviour, the less time there is between the trigger and the response. It's as if the brain stops waiting for permission. The moment a cue appears, memory fills in the rest, almost like muscle memory. You don't even have to think. You're simply doing what you've done 100 times before. This is also why breaking free feels so disorienting. You're not just changing what you do, you're dismantling an entire map your brain has been using for years. And at first, it feels like erasing a language you've spoken fluently without realizing it. But this is where the truth of the brain comes in. Because memory isn't fixed. It's not a book carved in stone. It's a story that can be rewritten. When you resist the habit, when you sit with the craving instead of answering it, you create new memory traces. They may start out faint, but with time they grow stronger, and slowly they compete with the old ones. That's why people who stick with change begin to feel something shift. It's not that the old memories disappear, they just lose their grip. The brain learns new ways to respond, and over time, those ways become the default. But the old loop doesn't give up easily. It waits. It's why relapse can happen after months or years, triggered by a single unexpected reminder. This isn't weakness. It's simply the nature of how memory works. The loop isn't gone, it's dormant. And that's why recovery isn't just about stopping. It's about building enough new pathways that the old ones fade into the background where they belong. But here's what's remarkable. Every time you don't give in, every time you sit through the discomfort, every time you choose something else, you're not just resisting, you're teaching your brain. You're showing it that the loop isn't the only option anymore, and with enough repetition that lesson sticks, and that's where hope lives. Because memory, the very thing that locks the loop in place, is also the thing that can set you free. It's the same mechanism, just pointed in a different direction. And if the brain can be trained into addiction, it can be trained out of it too. If memory writes the loops of addiction, genetics decides how deep those grooves might run before they even begin. Some people can experiment, step away, and never look back. Others touch the same thing once and find it harder to let go than they ever imagined. This difference isn't about strength or willpower. It starts long before choice ever enters the picture. It starts with the quiet instructions written into the brain and body. Genetics doesn't control everything, but it sets the stage. Inside every one of us is a unique blueprint that shapes how our brain responds to pleasure, stress, and reward. For some, the dopamine system, the very network that drives craving, runs differently. It might be more sensitive, firing harder and faster when it encounters a rewarding experience, or in some cases it might be less sensitive, leaving the brain searching for stronger stimulation to feel the same satisfaction others reach more easily. In both cases, the wiring creates vulnerability, not because it's broken, but because it tilts the balance of how the brain learns from reward. Researchers have found that certain gene variations can affect how dopamine works in the brain. These differences influence everything from how strongly you feel the initial rush of pleasure to how quickly your brain adapts to it. Some people are more likely to build strong associations between a habit and the relief it brings. For them, the first experience isn't just memorable, it's magnetic. Their brain tags it with extra importance, making it easier for a loop to form and harder for it to fade. But it's not only dopamine. Other systems matter too. Stress plays a role, and genetics can determine how reactive your body is to it. Some people inherit a more sensitive stress response. Their cortisol levels spike higher and stay elevated longer, and when stress hits hard, their brains are more likely to look for quick relief. In that state, the reward system doesn't just nudge, it grabs hold. The brain doesn't care what solves the discomfort. It only cares that it stops, and it remembers what works. Even impulse control has roots in genetics. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that weighs consequences and helps resist temptation, matures differently in different people. Some inherit a system that's naturally better at hitting the brakes. Others, through no fault of their own, start with a weaker grip. It doesn't mean they're doomed. It means that from the beginning they've been running uphill. And then there's family history. If addiction runs in your bloodline, it isn't just because of shared behavior. It's because the genes that shape reward sensitivity, stress response, and impulse control are often passed down. That doesn't mean addiction is guaranteed. It means the road to it is shorter and easier to travel. For someone without those vulnerabilities, the same habit might stay casual. For someone with them, the habit can carve a deeper track almost without effort. But genetics isn't destiny. It doesn't write the ending. It only writes the opening chapters. What happens after that depends on experience, environment, and choices repeated over time. A vulnerable brain can stay safe if it's never pushed into the loop. A resilient brain can fall into addiction if the right pressures hit hard enough. The wiring makes a difference, but it's only one part of the picture. And here's the hopeful part. The brain is plastic. Even if you inherit vulnerabilities, they are not unchangeable. The circuits that tilt toward addiction can also be trained to tilt away from it. The very same biology that makes some people more susceptible can, with time and effort, be reshaped. That's why people recover. That's why change, though hard, is always possible. But to understand how these inherited tendencies turn into lived experience, we need to look at the world around us. Because genes might load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger, and the people, places and patterns you grow up in can make all the difference in how the loop begins. If genetics lays the groundwork and memory builds the loops, there's one more force that shapes addiction in ways we often overlook: other people. Social addiction isn't always about the substance or the habit itself. Sometimes it's about the world wrapped around it. The friends, the routines, the places, the unspoken rules. We are wired to connect, and sometimes those connections keep us hooked, even when every part of us wants to stop. From the moment we're born, The brain is built for social learning. Mirror neurons fire when we see someone else act. We copy, we adapt, and we fit in because survival once depended on it. In the past, staying with the group meant safety. Today, it means something quieter, but no less powerful. We learn what's normal by watching each other, and if the people around you drink to relax, smoke when they're stressed, or scroll endlessly when they're bored, your brain takes note. It files it away, not as danger, but as routine. That's how social addiction takes root. It doesn't feel like addiction at first. It feels like belonging. You share a drink because your friends do. You stay up late staring at screens because that's what everyone else is doing. You laugh, you talk, you bond, and without even realizing it, you start pairing the habit with connection. And connection is one of the strongest rewards the brain knows. This is why certain habits are so hard to break, even when you want to. You're not just fighting the chemical pull of dopamine. You're fighting the fear of losing your place in the group. Your brain isn't built to risk isolation. It will choose acceptance over discomfort almost every time. And so, even if the habit stops feeling good, the social reward stays powerful. You keep saying yes, not because you want the thing itself, but because you want the closeness that comes with it. The brain's reward system doesn't separate the two. It ties them together. It links the cigarette to the conversation outside during a break. It links the drink to the laughter around the table. It links the shared glow of screens to the sense of being part of something, even if it's only for a while. Break the habit, and you risk breaking the connection. At least that's what your brain believes. And here's what makes this even harder. Social triggers are everywhere. It's one thing to resist a craving in private. It's another thing entirely when you're surrounded by people who are still feeding theirs. The smell, the sight, the sound of it. It's all amplified when it's shared. Your brain doesn't just crave the habit. It craves the feeling of being part of the group that comes with it. But this isn't just about friends or family. Society itself plays a part. Advertisements that celebrate indulgence, movies and shows that glamorize it, social media that turns habits into trends. All of it feeds into the same quiet message. This is normal. This is what people do. And the more normal it feels, the harder it is to imagine stepping away from it. Because stepping away doesn't just feel like losing a habit, it feels like losing a piece of the world you live in. Yet here's the truth hidden under all of this. Social addiction can work in the other direction too. If connection can keep you trapped, it can also pull you out. The same brain that mirrors bad habits can mirror good ones. When you spend time around people who've broken free, who've built new routines, who've found other ways to cope, your brain starts to adjust. It starts to see new patterns. It begins to believe that another way is possible. That's why support systems matter so much. They don't just give advice, they retrain the brain. They replace one kind of normal with another. And over time, the new normal begins to feel just as natural as the old one once did. If the people around you can shape your habits, technology can take those same instincts and magnify them in ways the brain was never prepared for. Screens don't just sit quietly in our lives anymore. They glow, they ping, they pull, and they feed a reward system that doesn't care whether the source of stimulation comes from a chemical, a habit, or a tiny device that you check without even realizing it. Technology has turned addiction into something quieter and harder to see. You don't measure it in bottles or cigarettes. You measure it in swipes, taps, and hours that disappear without you noticing. And the strangest part is that it doesn't feel like a trap, because it doesn't always hurt. It often feels normal. It feels like part of living. That's what makes it so powerful. Every app, every platform, every notification is built on the same principle. The reward system loves unpredictability. It's the same mechanism that once helped our ancestors search for food or explore new places. When something might pay off but you don't know when, dopamine spikes in anticipation. That's why slot machines are addictive, and it's why your phone can hold you for hours. Every swipe might bring something new, Every refresh might deliver something better. Your brain doesn't just like that, it's wired for it. And then there are the cues, the vibration in your pocket, the sound of a notification, the sight of an unopened message. Each one is a tiny trigger, and your brain treats it like it matters, because it does, at least chemically. The loop begins before you've even picked up the phone. You feel the urge, you respond, you get the hit of relief, whether it's a message, a like, or simply the satisfaction of checking. But here's the thing, the more you repeat it, the deeper the loop digs in. And just like with substances, tolerance begins to build. What was once exciting becomes routine. A single notification isn't enough. You start checking even when there's nothing there. Your brain has learned to crave the act itself, not the result. You scroll not because you're interested, but because the motion is familiar. The habit has replaced the reason. And this is where invisible dependencies form. They don't leave the obvious marks that other addictions do. You don't wake up hungover from a night spent staring at a screen. But you feel it in other ways, in the restless pull to check your phone even when you don't want to, in the hollow unease that creeps in when it's out of reach, in the quiet discomfort of stillness because the brain has grown so used to constant input that silence feels unbearable. Technology has become a perfect mirror for the brain's reward system. Every swipe is a small gamble, every click is a cue, every moment of boredom is a trigger, and because the world is built to keep those triggers everywhere, there's no natural stopping point. The feed never ends. The notifications never run out. It's a loop without a pause button. But here's the part that makes this even more complicated. Unlike other habits, this one is hard to see because it's shared. When everyone around you is doing it, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like culture. It feels like life. And that makes it even harder to question. Yet, just like every other form of addiction, it comes from the same place in the brain. It isn't proof that you're broken. It's proof that your brain is responding exactly the way it was designed to. Only now the world around you has learned how to push those buttons faster, harder, and longer than nature ever intended. But there's something else about technology that reveals an even deeper truth about addiction itself. Control is not what we think it is, because when the loop has been running long enough, it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels automatic. If technology has shown us how easy it is to get pulled into a loop without noticing, the next step is understanding why it feels like you can't stop, even when you know you should. This is the point where addiction stops looking like a series of decisions and starts feeling like something else entirely, a kind of automatic script that runs without your permission. This is the hijacking of choice. When you first begin any habit, it feels voluntary. You decide to try it. You decide to repeat it. Even the early stages of overindulgence still carry the illusion of control. You tell yourself you could quit any time if you really wanted to. But as the habit digs deeper, the brain starts to change. The reward system grows stronger, while the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for judgment, impulse control, and long-term thinking, quietly weakens. This doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. Each repetition strengthens the automatic pathways in the brain's basal ganglia, the region that handles routines and habits. At the same time, the circuits in the prefrontal cortex that are supposed to keep those routines in check lose ground. Over time, it's as though the part of you that decides and the part of you that simply reacts switch places. That's why so many people describe addiction as if they're watching themselves do it. They know what's happening, they know they don't want it, and yet they feel their hands moving, their minds justifying, their bodies following the same old pattern. It's not because they don't care, it's because their choice has been quietly rerouted from the conscious level to the automatic one, and the brain reinforces this even further. When you give in to a craving, the dopamine spike doesn't just reward the behavior, it also weakens the part of your brain that resists it. The next time you face the same craving, the resistance is a little softer, and the habit is a little stronger. This is why breaking out of addiction feels like trying to push back against something that's no longer in front of you. It's inside you, built into the very wiring that once helped you learn everything from walking to tying your shoes. But this doesn't mean you've lost control forever. It only means control is harder to reach. Because while the automatic brain is fast, the conscious brain is slower, but it's not powerless. The challenge is that you can't outshout the automatic system with sheer willpower. You have to retrain it. You have to build new loops that can run just as automatically as the old ones once did. And this is where many people feel stuck. They believe they've failed because they can't make themselves stop by deciding to stop. But that isn't failure, it's biology. You don't undo years of reinforced wiring in one act of determination. You change it one small interruption at a time, over and over, until the brain begins to see a different pattern and shift toward it. Here's the other quiet truth about the hijacking of choice. It's not total. Even at the height of addiction, there are moments, tiny ones, when choice slips back in. The pause before you light the cigarette, the breath before you pour the drink, the second before you open the app. They're small, almost invisible, but they're there. And those moments matter, because they are the doorways back to control. But first, you have to understand just how powerful this rewiring is. Because the longer a habit runs, the deeper it digs, and the harder it is to believe it can ever change. And yet, the brain that builds these loops is also the brain that can dismantle them. The same wiring that keeps you stuck can, with enough time and repetition, be turned towards something else. But before we start to explore how the brain reclaims that lost ground, we need to go deeper into how addiction changes the very structure of the mind. If choice feels hijacked, it's because the brain itself has been changed by the habit. Addiction doesn't just live in the background of your thoughts. It reshapes the very structure of the mind, quietly, gradually, until what was once a pattern of behaviour becomes part of the brain's architecture. But the most important thing to understand is this. The same process that wires addiction in can also wire it out. The brain is plastic. That word doesn't mean fragile, it means adaptable. Every thought, every action, every repetition leaves a trace in the neural circuits, and when something is repeated often enough, that trace becomes a path. Synapses, the tiny gaps where neurons communicate, fire together over and over until they form a stronger connection. You've probably heard the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. This is what it means. Addiction is simply that process running on overdrive. Each time you repeat a habit, the basal ganglia, the part of the brain responsible for automatic routines, strengthens those pathways. The prefrontal cortex, which handles self-control and long-term decision-making, gradually loses influence because it isn't being used in the same way. Meanwhile, the reward system keeps firing, reinforcing the loop with dopamine and teaching the brain that this path isn't just an option, it's the default. But this rewiring doesn't only affect the obvious parts of the brain. The amygdala, which processes emotion, also plays a role. It tags the habit with feeling, relief, comfort, escape, and those emotional markers deepen the pathway even further. The hippocampus, responsible for memory, stores every cue and trigger that ever came before the habit, making it easier to repeat the loop the next time those triggers appear. Over time, the brain doesn't just remember what you do, it prepares for it, almost automatically. This is why addiction can feel so much bigger than you. It's not only a matter of will, it's the result of thousands of repetitions shaping the brain until the habit feels less like something you do and more like something you are. But that isn't the whole story, because while repetition can carve these deep grooves, repetition in the other direction can carve new ones too. When you start resisting the loop, even in small ways, you begin to activate different circuits. The prefrontal cortex, long overshadowed, starts to wake up again. Each pause before giving in, each moment you choose not to follow the craving, strengthens it. At first it's barely noticeable, but over time, those pauses build into something powerful. Neuroplasticity doesn't care if the change is good or bad. It only cares that it's repeated. And this is the key to recovery. Each time you interrupt the old pattern and replace it with a new one, you're literally reshaping the brain. Slowly, the old pathways weaken. The synapses stop firing so easily. The brain begins to prune them, just as it prunes unused connections elsewhere. Meanwhile, new connections, new habits grow stronger. But the early stages of this change feel strange because the brain resists it. It's not because the brain wants to hurt you. It's because it's efficient. It wants to stick with what's familiar. That's why cravings spike when you try to stop. That's why the old loops feel louder. The brain is simply trying to pull you back to the well-worn path. But if you keep walking the new one, no matter how rough it feels at first, eventually it gets smoother. This is why recovery often comes in quiet increments, not dramatic breakthroughs. You don't notice the rewiring all at once. You notice it the day the craving isn't as sharp. The day the pause between trigger and action is just a little longer. The day you realise that what once felt automatic now feels like a choice again. That is the brain changing itself, one small step at a time. But here's the part many people miss. This rewiring doesn't erase the old pathways entirely. They don't vanish. They just grow weaker, quieter, less dominant. They can still be reactivated if the right triggers line up. This is why relapse happens. It's not failure. It's simply the brain briefly remembering an old path before it remembers the new one. And this is why persistence matters. Each time you return to the new path, you strengthen it. And eventually, something remarkable happens. The new pathways become strong enough that they start to feel natural. What was once effortful becomes automatic. The craving that once shouted turns into a whisper you can ignore. The old loop doesn't control you anymore because the brain has learned a better one. If the brain rewires itself through repetition, it's time to talk about why so many people believe they can overpower that wiring with nothing but sheer determination. This is the myth of willpower, the idea that if you were simply strong enough, disciplined enough, or serious enough, you could walk away from addiction at any moment. But that's not how the brain works, and that's why this belief traps more people than it helps. Willpower lives in the prefrontal cortex, the same part of the brain that helps you plan, weigh consequences, and resist impulses. It's the seat of conscious control, the voice that says, "I shouldn't do this," even when every other part of you is leaning in the opposite direction. But here's the problem. In addiction, this part of the brain is fighting uphill against the much older, faster, and more automatic parts of the brain. The reward system, the basal ganglia, the emotional centers that drive craving. When you tell yourself you'll just stop, you're asking one slow rational system to overpower a much faster, much stronger one that has been reinforced hundreds or thousands of times. And while willpower can hold out for a while, it's like holding your breath underwater. You can do it, but not forever. Eventually, the automatic circuits win. That isn't weakness, that's biology. This is why so many people wake up each morning convinced this will be the day they stop, only to give in by nightfall. It's not because they don't care. It's because willpower alone is a limited resource. It drains with stress. It erodes with fatigue. It vanishes under pressure. And addiction thrives in those cracks, waiting for the moment when the brain is too tired to keep fighting. And here's where the trap deepens. Every time willpower fails, shame steps in. You tell yourself you should have been stronger. You believe the loop is your fault, and that belief doesn't just hurt, it feeds the cycle. Because shame is stressful, and stress drives craving, and craving drives repetition. You don't break the loop by blaming yourself for it. You tighten it. The truth is, willpower was never meant to be the main tool for overcoming addiction. At best, it's a spark. The thing that gets you started. It helps you pause long enough to notice the loop. It gives you the strength to take the first step. But lasting change comes from building new pathways in the brain, not from endlessly wrestling with the old ones. You don't win by fighting the craving every single time. You win by teaching the brain to stop craving the same way in the first place. That's why people who break free from addiction often don't talk about being strong. They talk about building systems. They talk about routines, support, and replacing the old habit with something else. Because those things create new patterns, new automatic responses that don't rely on willpower. The goal isn't to resist forever. The goal is to rewire the brain until the resistance isn't needed anymore. And that's the part most people miss. The brain isn't a battlefield you win with force. It's a landscape you reshape with repetition. Each time you rely on willpower alone, you burn energy. Each time you build a new habit, you build a path. Over time, the path beats the fight every single time. But this shift doesn't happen instantly. It takes time, and it takes understanding. If willpower fails not because you're weak, but because the brain has been rewired, then it's time to look at one of the most overlooked truths about addiction. Stopping doesn't just feel hard, it feels like loss, and not just any loss. For many, it feels like saying goodbye to something that's been there through every bad day, every moment of stress, every lonely night. In a strange, unsettling way, it feels like losing a friend. Addiction isn't only about chemistry, it's about comfort. The habit, whether it's a substance, a screen, or a ritual you can't break, becomes woven into your life like a constant companion. It's there when you're anxious. It's there when you're bored. It's there when you don't know what else to do. And even if you hate it, even if it's hurting you, there's a part of your brain that has learned to see it as familiar. And the brain loves what it knows, even when what it knows isn't good for you. This is why stopping feels so strange. When you decide to walk away from the habit, you're not just fighting craving. You're stripping away something that's been tied to comfort for so long that your mind treats it like a source of safety. You're left not only with withdrawal, but with an empty space, a quiet where the habit used to be. That space feels wrong at first. It feels like something is missing because for a long time it was never missing. And that emptiness is powerful. It's what drives so many people back into the loop, not because they want the pleasure, but because they want to fill the gap. They want to feel normal again. They want the familiar weight of the habit because, even if it's harmful, it feels like something steady in a world that often isn't. Here's the part that makes this even harder. Your brain remembers the habit not just as a behavior, but as a companion to your emotions. Every late-night cigarette, every drink after a hard day, every scroll through a glowing screen when you couldn't sleep. Your brain doesn't just store the act, it stores the comfort. So when you remove it, you're not just breaking a habit, you're breaking a bond. And bonds, even unhealthy ones, don't dissolve quietly. There's grief in this process, and grief has a way of convincing you to turn back. Just once, the craving says. Just one more time. But every one more time reaffirms the bond, makes it feel alive again, and pushes the emptiness back for just a little while. But here's what most people don't realize. That empty space isn't just loss, it's opportunity. Because what feels unbearable in the beginning, the silence where the habit used to be, is the very place where something new can grow. The brain doesn't erase its need for comfort. It simply learns new ways to find it. And if you keep holding that space open long enough, other things begin to take root. At first, it's small. A moment of calm that doesn't come from the habit. A bit of pride that you made it through a craving. A clearer morning, a steadier night. These are the first signs that the brain is rewiring, that the bond is shifting from what once hurt you to what can actually heal you. It's slow, and it doesn't feel perfect, but it's real. And that's why stopping feels like losing a friend, because in a way, it is. You're letting go of something that's been with you through everything, even if it wasn't good for you. But the truth is, that friend was never your ally. It was only a loop disguised as comfort. And when you finally break it, you give yourself the chance to build something that isn't pretending to care for you. It actually does. If breaking free from addiction feels like losing a friend, relapse is the moment that friend shows up at your door again, uninvited but familiar, and your brain doesn't know how to say no. It's one of the hardest parts of recovery to talk about because it carries so much shame. But the truth is, relapse isn't proof of failure, it's proof of how the brain works, and once you understand that, it becomes far less about guilt and far more about learning. Relapse happens because the pathways that form the addiction don't simply vanish. When you build a habit over months or years, the brain wires it in deeply, and while new pathways can be created, the old ones never fully disappear. They grow weaker, quieter, easier to ignore, but they're still there, like faint trails through the woods. All it takes is the right trigger, the right stress, or the wrong moment, and the brain can find its way back to them faster than you expect. This is why relapse feels sudden. One moment you're fine, confident even, and the next, it's as if the craving has been waiting just beneath the surface. But it isn't sudden. It's the result of a series of small shifts, stress building up, self-care slipping, triggers going unchecked, until finally the brain tips back into an old, familiar loop. And here's the key to understanding it. Relapse isn't a lack of willpower, it's biology. When an old pathway lights up, it doesn't ask for permission, it fires automatically. The dopamine system floods with anticipation. The craving feels urgent, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that should slow you down, is often too quiet to compete. This doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. But if relapse is biological, it's also predictable. Researchers have studied the brain during recovery and found that triggers tied to old habits can activate the reward system years later. That doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat the cycle forever. It means you need to know how the brain behaves so you can see the warning signs before they overwhelm you. Relapse often follows a pattern. First comes the emotional stage. Stress, exhaustion, or loneliness starts to build. You don't act on it yet, but the discomfort is there. Next is the mental stage. Memories of the habit surface, and you start thinking about it, sometimes in subtle ways. Just one time wouldn't hurt. And then, if nothing interrupts the cycle, comes the physical stage. You give in, not because you don't care, but because the brain has rehearsed this script so many times it feels inevitable. But it isn't inevitable. The same way the brain can follow that old loop, it can learn to interrupt it. Every time you catch yourself in the earlier stages, when it's just a thought, just a whisper, you weaken the loop a little more. Each interruption teaches the brain that there's another path forward, that the old one isn't the only road anymore. And here's the most important part. Relapse doesn't erase progress. It doesn't send you back to the beginning. Even if you slip, the new pathways you've built don't disappear. They're still there, waiting to be used again. Recovery is not a straight line. It's a process of rewiring, and every attempt, every single time you try, strengthens the circuits that will eventually win. This is why people who keep going after relapse succeed. It isn't because they suddenly become stronger. It's because they stop treating relapse like proof they can't change. They see it for what it really is, a reminder that the brain takes time to rebuild. That's not failure. That's how learning works. But if relapse shows us how stubborn the brain can be, it also shows us how much it can change. Because the very fact that you can return to recovery after a setback proves something powerful. The new pathways can outgrow the old ones if you keep walking them. If relapse proves how persistent old pathways can be, recovery proves that even the deepest wiring in the brain can change. The shift doesn't happen in one sweeping transformation. It happens in small steps, almost invisible at first, but powerful enough to reshape the mind over time. This is how you reclaim the brain, not by force but by repetition, by patience, and by understanding how every small change adds up. The brain doesn't care if the action you repeat is big or small, it only cares that you repeat it. Each time you make a different choice, each time you interrupt the craving instead of feeding it, you strengthen a new pathway. At first, it's fragile. It doesn't feel natural. You have to fight for it. But just like the habit that built the addiction in the first place, it grows with every repetition. This is why small shifts matter more than big promises. Quitting in one sudden act of will sounds heroic, but for most people it isn't how the brain works. The brain learns in increments. You swap one response for another. You choose to wait 5 more minutes before you give in. You take a walk instead of reaching for the habit. These tiny moments feel meaningless when you're in them, but they are literally rewiring your brain, one spark of activity at a time. And then something almost invisible happens. The prefrontal cortex starts to wake up again. This is the part of the brain that addiction quieted down, the part that helps you pause, weigh consequences, and see past the craving in front of you. Every small act of resistance strengthens it. Every decision to hold back, even for a moment, builds its power. Slowly the balance shifts. The reward system stops running the show alone, and the thinking brain starts to take the wheel again. But this change isn't only about resisting, it's also about replacing. You can't simply erase a habit. The brain hates a vacuum. If you take something away, it looks for something else to fill the space. That's why building new routines is so important. Exercise, hobbies, social connections, even simple rituals like going for a walk or making tea. These things may seem unrelated to addiction, but they aren't. They give the brain new rewards to chase, new loops to follow, new maps to draw. Over time, those small replacements start to matter. The craving that once felt unbearable becomes quieter because the brain isn't just losing something, it's gaining alternatives. And this is how change sticks. Not because you've silenced the old pathway entirely, but because you've built new ones that are strong enough to take its place, and the brain loves efficiency. The more you repeat the new behavior, the less effort it takes. What was once deliberate becomes automatic. This is the turning point in recovery. The moment when what used to feel like a fight starts to feel like routine. You're not pushing against the old loop anymore. You're simply walking a new one. But here's the part that gives this even more power. Every small victory feeds itself. Each time you resist a craving, each time you choose something else, the brain doesn't just adapt, it rewards you. Not in a dramatic surge, but in steady, quiet reinforcement. You feel a little clearer, a little stronger, a little more certain that you're not trapped in the same loop forever. And those feelings are the proof that the wiring is changing. Recovery isn't about becoming someone new. It's about teaching your brain to stop clinging to the old patterns and start trusting the new ones. And it all begins with those tiny, ordinary choices that don't feel heroic at all. But if you keep stacking them, one after another, they become something extraordinary. And this is where the cycle starts to break. Not all at once, not in a dramatic moment, but in the quiet shift where your brain finally stops fighting you and starts working with you again. That's when the chains begin to loosen for good. But there's one more part to this process, and it's what comes after you've begun to reclaim the brain. Because recovery isn't just about breaking free, it's about staying free, and that path, while quieter, is just as important. If reclaiming the brain is the turning point, then what comes next isn't about one victory. It's about learning how to live in a way that keeps those victories from slipping away. This is the long road to freedom, and it's not quick, not simple, and not perfect. But it's real, and it's built the same way the brain built addiction in the first place, one step at a time, repeated until it becomes second nature. Freedom from addiction doesn't happen the moment you stop. It happens in the days and weeks and months after, when the brain is still learning that the old loop doesn't run the show anymore. At first, it's exhausting. Every craving feels like a battle. Every trigger feels dangerous. You're not just living, you're rewiring, and it takes energy. But then slowly the fights get smaller. The cravings lose their edge. The pauses between them grow longer. The world begins to feel different, not because it's changed, but because you have. This road isn't straight. There are plateaus where progress feels invisible. There are moments when you wonder if you've actually changed at all. But what's really happening in those moments is deeper than what you can feel. The brain is solidifying new pathways. What once required effort is becoming easier. What once felt impossible is starting to feel normal. This is the quiet part of recovery that no one notices because it doesn't feel dramatic, but it's where real freedom takes root. And then there are the tests. Life doesn't stop throwing stress your way just because you've decided to change. Bad days still come, triggers still appear, old memories still surface. But here's the difference. Every time you face those moments and choose differently, you teach your brain again. And each time, the lesson sticks a little better. You don't erase the old wiring, you simply outgrow it. This is why support matters so much on this road. No one rebuilds the brain alone. Whether it's friends, family, or people who have walked the same path, connection reinforces recovery. Just like social bonds can pull you into addiction, they can pull you out of it too. Every encouraging word, every shared story, every reminder that you're not alone is another layer of reinforcement for the brain. It says, this is safe, this is better, stay here. And slowly, freedom stops feeling fragile. The cravings that once felt unbearable become quiet background noise, like echoes from another life. The triggers lose their sharpness. You begin to trust yourself again, not because you've erased every trace of the old habit, but because you've built something stronger on top of it. But even then, the road isn't truly finished, because addiction isn't something you cure once and forget. It's something you outgrow and keep outgrowing. The difference is that eventually it stops feeling like a fight. It feels like maintenance, like brushing your teeth or locking your door at night. A habit you keep not because you're terrified of falling back, but because you've learned what it's like to live free, and you don't want to trade that for anything. And this is where the long road turns into something else entirely. It stops being about escaping addiction and starts being about building a life that feels too full, too rich, and too steady for addiction to fit into anymore. That's what freedom really looks like. It's not the absence of struggle, it's the presence of something better. But before we end this journey, there's one final step. Because after everything, the cravings, the rewiring, the rebuilding, there's a moment when you look back and realize that you're no longer in the same place you started. That's where the story of addiction ends, not in silence, but in a quiet breath, where you understand what it means to finally be free. If the long road to freedom is about rebuilding the brain one step at a time, the closing is about something simpler. Finally being able to breathe without the weight of the urge pressing down on you. Addiction begins as a spark. It grows into a loop, digs deep into the wiring of the brain, and for a long time, it feels permanent. But standing here, after everything we've explored, you can see it for what it really is. A pattern, not a life sentence. A map that can be redrawn. A road that can be left behind. The quiet breath at the end of this road isn't loud or triumphant. It isn't some dramatic victory shouted to the sky. It's subtle. It's the morning you wake up and realize you haven't thought about the craving in days. It's the night you sit in silence and notice that it doesn't feel heavy anymore. It's the first time you look at the thing that once pulled you in and feel nothing at all. That's what freedom feels like. Calm, ordinary, and steady. This is what the brain was built for. Change, growth, new wiring that turns desperate repetition into something softer and smaller until it no longer rules you. And the most powerful part is this. It happens because you stayed long enough for the brain to catch up with the life you wanted. Every small decision, every quiet refusal, every moment you held on instead of giving in rewrote the map until the old loops faded like paths through grass that nobody walks anymore. But maybe the most important part of all is this. Freedom from addiction doesn't mean you forget what it was like to be trapped. You remember. But that memory isn't a threat anymore. It's proof. Proof of how far you've come. Proof that the brain that once chained you down can just as easily set you free. Proof that what feels impossible at first can become your normal if you keep walking forward, one step at a time. And now, with the loop quiet and the urge no longer louder than your own thoughts, you're left with something that feels almost strange in its simplicity. Space. Space to breathe. Space to choose. Space to live without the constant hum of craving in the background. That's what this whole journey was about. Not fighting forever, but reaching the point where you no longer need to fight at all. So take this moment, if only for yourself, and let it sink in. Because every bit of science we've uncovered, every part of the brain we've explored, every explanation of cravings and wiring and repetition leads here, to the understanding that addiction was never a life you were meant to live. It was just a detour. And you found your way back. And if you're still somewhere in the middle of this path, still rewiring, still waiting for that quiet to come, remember this. The brain always learns. The loops can always change. And the breath you're looking for, the one beyond the urge, is waiting for you, steady and patient, like it's been there the whole time. And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. No rush, no noise, just the quiet reminder that freedom isn't loud, it's calm and it's yours. Alright, let's bring it to a close. Thank you for walking through this journey with me tonight. Addiction can feel heavy, it can feel complicated. But what we've seen is that it isn't unbreakable. It's not who you are. It's simply how the brain learns. And what the brain learns, it can also unlearn. So if you're here because you're curious, or because you're in the middle of it yourself, or even if you're just listening because you needed something calm to fall asleep to, I want you to take this with you. Nothing in your brain is permanent. Not the craving, not the loop, not the weight you've been carrying. Every part of it can be changed, one small choice at a time, until the urge fades and you find yourself breathing in a way you didn't know was possible. If this quiet exploration helped you, even in the smallest way, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like or subscribe. Not just because it helps this little corner of calm grow, but because it means there will always be a place here for anyone else who needs to hear that their mind isn't their enemy. It's simply waiting to be rewired. So take a breath. Let the noise in your head settle, and if you're ready, let this be the night where you don't need to fight anything at all. You've done enough. You are enough. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.